Since I was a kid, I've always loved the rain. Whenever it starts outside, everything just slows down a bit. The sound, the smell, it's also peaceful. I'll usually just sit outside and watch for a while. And at one point, I started wondering, what if I could bring that feeling inside and control it whenever I want? Not just the sound, but actual rain. So I built a system that creates real rainfall over this aquarium every single night. And today, I'm going to show you how I built it. But before I could start building anything though, I had to clear out my old tank. Someone was coming to pick up the fish from my Tanganyika setup, and I figured I could probably catch them without tearing the whole tank apart. But I was incredibly wrong. Everything had to be removed. But honestly, it worked out because it meant I could start completely fresh. And while I sat around figuring out the logistics of building this tank, I got distracted for a while playing Fishing Clash. I actually started playing pretty casually just to kill time. But then I started unlocking new spots, catching different fish, and kind of fell down the rabbit hole of trying to collect everything. There's a mode where you move across a map completing different catches, and I kept telling myself, one more, just to unlock the next thing. I also started upgrading my boat a bit, which makes a bigger difference than I expected. Better catches, a few extra bonuses, it adds up. And then I tried arena mode, which is basically real-time matches against other players. It's pretty chill at first, but once you start getting close scores, it gets oddly competitive. Most of the time though, I just ended up playing it the same way I like watching rain. Just casting, reeling, and zoning out for a bit. Jump in and fish with me. If you're a new user, download the game by using my link in the description or scan the QR code. Enter my gift code BiotaWorlds and get your $20 value reward for free. It's an awesome starter boost. Once I finally got focused again, I decided to reuse the same rocks from that Tanganyika build. They're big, dramatic, and perfect for creating some elevation. But I also ordered a few new things to further enhance it and give the tank a new vibe. Including a few pieces of Pacific driftwood, mostly because they were on sale. I kept the tank running to make sure the filter media stayed cycled. But when it was time to drain the tank for the rebuild, I noticed there were a few baby shell dwellers left over. I must have missed them for the week or so that the tank was empty because they were so small. This meant I had to spend the next 10 minutes chasing tiny fish around the tank trying to catch them. Eventually, they were all out safely and I could finally start the build. The first step was leveling out the sand and removing some of the remaining floating plants. Then I started placing the base stones. A couple really large ones went in first. These were basically going to be my mountains, letting me build the scape higher while keeping everything stable. While I was moving rocks around, I found one with this perfect little crevice running through it, and immediately I knew this was going to be the waterfall. I put it in place and tested just to see how water flowed through the gaps, and it worked beautifully. Water naturally cascaded through the cracks in a way that looked really organic, almost like it had always been there. I wanted to power the waterfall using the filter output, but there was a problem. There was about 6 inches between the filter outflow and the peak of the waterfall, and the flow coming out of that filter was way too strong. So I heated up some water to soften the end of a hose and forced it over the filter nozzle. The flowing water must have caused some commotion because about 1 million snails emerged from the sand. Once the basic flow was working, I started adding more rocks to fill out the structure. Then it was time to try the driftwood. I tried a few configurations, but nothing seemed to sit right with me. I think the rocks were so big that they competed for attention with the wood, instead of them complementing each other. And in this scape, the rocks won. When I routed the hose to the rocks though, a huge kink formed in the tubing, basically stopping the water entirely. So once again, I dropped the hose back in the hot water to soften that area. While it's hot, it becomes incredibly flexible, so I could shape it exactly how I needed without collapsing the tube. Then, I cooled it down quickly with an ice cube, locking the shape in place. To secure the hose, I used a classic aquascaper trick, a little cotton ball with a little super glue. Now the hose was firmly attached to the back of the rock. Next, I cut a small hole with a knife in the hose so water could spray out over the front of the stone. Except when I tried, it didn't. The water just bypassed the hole completely, following the path of least resistance, and continued flowing straight out the end of the hose. Using my hand, I restricted the flow at the end of the tube, and just as suspected, water sprayed from the created hole. I just needed a way to consistently maintain that pressure. The solution ended up being an old filter sponge. I rubber banded it to the end of the hose so water could still escape but at a slower rate, just enough that some pressure built up inside the tube. That pressure forced water out of the waterfall opening. I placed a small rock in front of the outlet to shape the flow. At this point, the waterfall was actually starting to look pretty good. I added one more rock that made things look a bit more natural and allowed water to bridge the gap and create a second, smaller drip fall on the other side. Then I placed a few more rocks covering the sponged output and had a fully functioning waterfall without any extra pumps in the aquarium. However, the water flow was a bit too strong for my liking, so I cut some relief holes in the back of the hose to alleviate some of the water pressure. Now this is much more like the peaceful waterfall I had envisioned when I started. The snails immediately started exploring on their new wet rocks as an extension of their water habitat. From the side, you could see the tubing in the rear, but from the front, you could only see a little start of the output tubing. But honestly, I'm not too concerned with that. Luckily, my old betta tank was still packed full of plants. I rummaged through and grabbed all of the big pieces of bucephalandra and stuffed them in between the cracks of the rocks. And superglued one to the side in a dip. Then I added some more plants to bring things together in the underwater part, but not too much. Most of the planting for this tank was going to happen above the water line. I hydrated a big batch of sphagnum moss and soon had a big fluffy bucket full. Then I grabbed a few cheap houseplants from Home Depot and removed all the soil off their roots. I ended up removing this rock because it covered up a perfect pocket for a fern. Then I stuffed it full of moss and placed a plant on top. The constant water flow keeps the moss wet, perfect for this fern's roots to sit on top of. I did the same thing around the end of the hose. The nerve plants were easy. They actually love having their roots in water. So I just wedged them between the rocks, keeping the leaves above the water line. I did the same in the back corner with some purple waffle plant. And just like that, planting was complete. A slender package arrived in the mail. This is nothing more than a simple flower box tray, but this will act as the rain chamber. They didn't have black, so I opted for white, like a cloud. It's just barely long enough to sit on the rim of the tank, nothing that I'm too confident in. To give it a little more length, I used some binder clips on the edge. I dipped into my secret stash and got one of the brand new pumps that came with my recently acquired saltwater setup, a Ciche Micra. This little guy should be just enough to do the job. I'll admit, I got a little ambitious about how fast I would finish the rain chamber, and well, accidentally got a fish before it was finished. Not a huge problem, he'll be okay in there. I got him acclimated and into the tank. He took off immediately. We'll get to him later. I may or may not have procrastinated another week and ended up getting the other fish for the tank before completing the rain chamber. I really have to work on my discipline. Enter a school of 12 red neon blue-eyed rainbows from some guy on Craigslist. They school together quite well, but I'll get more into them when they color up. Now it's time to actually build the rain chamber. I place a scrap piece of wood underneath. This will 1. Protect my counter, and 2. Prevent cracking in the plastic. I drilled small holes in an offset grid pattern the entire length of the tray. Next, I had to drill an entry point for the hose. A big drill bit would undoubtedly crack the plastic, so instead of drilling one big hole, I slowly stepped up from small to larger drill bits. I did this a few times to create a hole that was generally large enough for the tube, and shaped it out with a knife. Then threaded the tubing through. The other end was heated up in water and slid over the output of the pump. I placed the tray back on the aquarium and dropped the pump in the intentional gap that I left behind the main rocks, sitting on another rock, so sand won't get sucked into the pump. I plugged it in, and it didn't work. Well, it almost did. The water was trying, but it wasn't strong enough to reach the tray. Even on full power, I realized the excess tubing was sagging too low. Once I lifted it above the rim, water finally started flowing. It wasn't a lot, but I didn't want much. It was perfect. The water flowed into the tray and through the holes. But it didn't look like rain. It was more like streams than droplets. I didn't like it at all. That's not what rain looks like in real life. But at least I knew the general mechanics of the overall system worked for the concept. It just needed to be refined. I tried using some window screen to restrict the flow a bit, but it basically yielded the exact same result. I ended up getting some synthetic rope and tried to thread it through the holes, but it was too big. I cut it into about 1-inch pieces and removed the outer layer. From there, I burned the tips to make sure it was more solid and used a mechanical pencil to push it through the holes. Once in place, it was super glued in position. After about what seemed like 7,000 iterations of that, I finally had everything finished. Everything got put back into place and prepared for the next test. Water flowed and started to fill up the tray, and while I was setting up the next shot, the tray fell into the tank. Too much weight from the water caused the tray to bend in the middle, losing all support. I needed to add reinforcement over the length somehow. The answer was metal rods. but they were a true 36 inches, where the inside of the lid was only about 35 inches. So I had to cut it down with a metal Dremel bit. I used the cotton ball superglue method to quickly bond the rods to the tray. While I had the tray out and flipped, I decided to cut the end of the strings to be shorter and more consistent. Let's try this again. It finally worked. These look like real rain droplets because the water pools up in the tray and soaks through the string. At the bottom of the string, the water eventually gets too heavy and drops. Not all at the same time or the same consistency. That's what makes it look really real. I love how the drops bounce off the leaves. It looks just like a real rainforest. There was only one troublesome stream left, but a tiny bit of extra super glue fixed that. I added a couple more rocks because the right side seemed to end a bit abruptly, and this would smooth it out. With everything functioning properly, I could finally cut the excess tubing. However, I didn't want it to be raining all the time, so I plugged in the pump to a smart outlet, and through the app, let it run for 2 minutes at 8 p.m. every day. Because of the tray capacity, this gives me about 15 to 20 minutes of actual rain time. Admittedly, the splash from the drops gets on the glass and leaves spots, which makes it quite a hassle to keep clean. I let a bit of algae grow because our first inhabitant, the freshwater goby, just loves to munch on it. He just hangs out, sucking on the rocks, sand, and glass all day. But one day, I noticed the waterfall had stopped, which was odd because the filter was still running. I checked and found that the sponge at the end of the hose had broken free, letting all the water bypass the waterfall. I had to remove the fern, which had rooted into the sponge, re-rubber band the sponge back into place, and reset the fern, which proved to be much harder to do the second time around. But at least the waterfall was back. A little over 3 months has passed and I really enjoy this tank. The rain causes the rainbows to group up together nicely, and it looks beautiful now that they've gotten their colors. In the dark areas, their blue eyes really pop. And in the brighter areas, you see the amazing color on their body with that shiny blue stripe. Even the baby shell dwellers have gotten some size to them. And while I can't control the weather outside, I can still enjoy a nice, peaceful rainfall from my living room every night. And if you haven't checked it out yet, be sure to download Fishing Clash using my code linked below.